Sometimes the most broken souls find healing in the unthinkable. In the vast frozen prairies of Kansas in 1887, where the wind howls forgotten secrets, Emily Carter learns that loneliness can kill more surely than a bullet. At 24, marked by a loss that stole her breath, she faces a winter that seemed like it would never end. The wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin's planks, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow and something darker, the promise of a merciless winter. Emily Carter pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers trembling not so much from the cold as from exhaustion. 3 months. 3 long months since Robert had closed his eyes for the last time, leaving her alone in the white expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see. The cabin they had built together, their hands mingled on every board, their laughter echoing in every corner, was just a tomb of memories. Supplies were dwindling dangerously. The flour sack held only a handful of grayish powder, and the potatoes stored in the root cellar were beginning to sprout, their pale tendrils reaching for a light that wouldn't come for months. Emily approached the frosted window, scratching at the layer of ice with her nails that obscured the view. Outside, the storm had been raging for 2 days, turning the world into a hostile white vortex. The tracks from the mailman's last visit, a week ago, had long since vanished under the relentless snowflakes. She mechanically brought her hand to her throat, where Robert's wedding ring still hung, attached to a thin gold chain. The metal was cold against her skin, as cold as the bed she could no longer share, even with ghosts. Her lips moved silently, forming words she could no longer utter aloud. How am I supposed to go on? The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, its orange flames dancing like hungry spirits. Soon, even the wood would run out. Emily had tried to go out and gather some, but her strength was failing her, and each trip outside left her gasping, her lungs burning in the icy air. A dull thud made her jump. Something had hit the outer wall. She strained her ears, her heart pounding. The wind, no doubt. Or maybe a tree branch torn off by the gust. But the sound repeated, more methodical this time, as if someone... No, it was impossible. No one would dare venture out in weather like this. Emily moved toward the door, hesitated, then pressed her ear against the rough wood. Nothing but the incessant howling of the wind and the rattling of loose shutters. Yet something deep inside whispered that she wasn't alone, that in this glacial night, something, or someone, lurked around her home. She backed away, clutching the wedding ring between her fingers until it hurt. Fear and hope mingled within her in a bitter cocktail. For deep in her wounded heart, a part of her almost wished she wasn't alone anymore, even if it meant facing the unknown. Subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Emily isn't done surprising us. Dawn timidly broke over a transformed landscape. The storm had calmed during the night, leaving behind a muffled silence that seemed to absorb all sounds in the world. Emily awoke curled up near the dead hearth, her body aching from a night spent on the hard floor. She had fallen asleep there, not daring to return to her bedroom. So disturbed was she by the mysterious noises. Painfully straightening up, she immediately noticed that something had changed. The light filtering through the window seemed different, softer, as if bouncing off something new. She approached the front door, her heart pounding with an anticipation she dared not name. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the latch. The door opened with a familiar creak, and Emily held her breath. There, carefully placed on the snowy doorstep, was a carefully butchered piece of deer meat, still red and fresh despite the cold. Beside it, a small bundle of dried herbs was tied with coarse twine. Emily looked around, scanning the pristine whiteness that stretched in all directions. No visible footprints, as if her mysterious benefactor had flown over the snow. Only a few strange prints half erased by the wind hinted at a recent presence near her home. She picked up the gifts with hesitant gestures, as if she feared they would turn into a mirage. The meat was real, solid, and generous. The herbs gave off a familiar scent, wild thyme and prairie mint, remedies her mother had taught her to recognize in her youth. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty landscape, her voice lost in the silent immensity. Back inside, Emily placed her treasure on the raw wooden table. Her hands, which had been trembling from cold moments before, regained a forgotten steadiness as she rekindled the fire and prepared the meat. The smell of cooking quickly filled the cabin with a comforting warmth she hadn't known in weeks. As she stirred the simmering stew, Emily mechanically brought her hand to the wedding ring hanging from her neck. The metal had retained the warmth of her skin, and for the first time since Robert's death, this contact brought her not pain but a strange serenity, as if something within her was slowly beginning to break free from the grip of grief. She ate with an appetite she thought forever lost, savoring each bite like a blessing. Color returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, so dull for months, shone with a new light. Outside, the sun finally pierced through the clouds, casting sharp shadows on the crystalline snow. But Emily knew she wasn't done with surprises, for deep in her heart, a certainty grew. Her mysterious protector wasn't done revealing himself, and somewhere in the depths of her wounded soul, this thought no longer frightened her as much as it should have. The following days unfolded in a strange, comforting routine. Each morning, Emily found something on her doorstep, sometimes perfectly split kindling, sometimes dried berries wrapped in birch bark, sometimes even carefully tanned rabbit pelts. She never saw her benefactor, but his presence became more and more tangible. The tracks around the cabin multiplied, massive tracks that mysteriously vanished in the fresh snow, as if their owner knew secrets the prairie guarded jealously. Emily began to spy from her window, watching for a movement, a silhouette, any clue that might reveal the identity of this silent guardian angel. One evening, as she was making an herbal tea with the offered herbs, a sound froze her in place. It wasn't the furtive sound of previous nights, but something bolder. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching the hardened snow under a considerable weight. Emily blew out the candle and crept to the window, her heart pounding so loud she feared it could be heard outside. A massive silhouette stood out in the lunar gloom. The man, for it was undeniably a man, stood a few yards from her door, motionless as a 100-year-old oak. His imposing stature seemed to defy the elements themselves, and even in the darkness, Emily could sense the power emanating from him. She held her breath, fascinated despite her fear. The stranger wasn't trying to hide this time. On the contrary, he seemed to be waiting for something, as if he knew she was watching him. His broad shoulders were silhouetted against the starry sky, and Emily noticed he wore a bear hide as a coat, which further added to his striking appearance. Suddenly, the man turned his head slightly toward her window. Emily recoiled instinctively, but not quickly enough to avoid what felt like an exchange of glances through the frosted pane. A shiver ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. In that brief moment, she had perceived something in that silhouette. Not menace, but a strange form of protection, as if this man was standing guard. The stranger remained there for several minutes, a silent sentinel in the icy night. Then, with the same quiet assurance he had shown upon arriving, he walked away with his measured stride, his footsteps gradually fading into the muffled silence of the sleeping prairie. Emily remained by the window long after he left, Robert's wedding ring clutched between her fingers. For the first time in months, she no longer felt alone in the world. Someone was watching over her in this hostile immensity, someone who had chosen to protect her without asking for anything in return. This thought brought her a comfort she dared not admit, even to herself. The next morning brought a surprise that rattled Emily more than all the previous gifts. Opening her door, she discovered not only the usual presents, but also something that made her take a step back. Fresh footprints that led directly to her window, right where she had stood the previous evening. He had watched her back. This revelation stirred within her a troubling mix of emotions. Fear, yes, but also a form of excitement she refused to name. This mysterious man was no longer content to protect her from a distance. He was seeking to establish contact, however silent. She spent the day in an unusual state of anticipation, unable to focus on daily tasks. Her eyes kept returning to the window, watching for a movement that didn't come. The afternoon stretched on endlessly, and when the first shadows of twilight began to lengthen on the snow, Emily made a decision that surprised even herself. She lit a candle and placed it prominently on the windowsill, like a signal. If this man wanted to see her, he might as well see her clearly. This bold thought made her blush, but she didn't remove the flame. Night fell with its usual slowness, and Emily waited. She had put on her best dress, the one she wore on the day of her engagement to Robert, and styled her auburn hair with more care than she had in months. These preparations troubled her, but she couldn't help wanting to look her best. Around midnight he appeared. This time the man approached closer, and the candlelight finally revealed his features. Emily's breath hitched. He was a giant, much more imposing than she had imagined, with shoulders that seemed capable of carrying the whole world. His dark hair fell in thick curls on his shoulders, and his thick beard couldn't entirely hide a deep scar that ran across his left cheek. But it was his eyes that fascinated her most. In the golden light of the flame, they shone with a wild intensity, and yet Emily read in them an unexpected gentleness, a sadness that echoed her own. The man looked at her with absolute concentration, as if he was trying to etch every detail of her face into his memory. Emily felt herself blush under his scrutinizing gaze, but didn't look away. A silent dialogue began between them, made of exchanged glances and held breaths. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man retreated into the darkness. But before disappearing completely, he brought his hand to his heart in a gesture that strangely resembled a salute, or perhaps a promise. Emily remained frozen long after he left, her hand placed on her chest where her frantic heart beat. The days that followed this first visual encounter were marked by an electrifying wait. Emily found herself tending to her appearance each evening, preparing the candle with meticulous care, like a secret ritual that belonged only to her and this mysterious man. But he didn't return immediately, leaving Emily oscillating between disappointment and anticipation. It was a week later that everything changed. Emily had ventured outside to fetch water from the well, bundled in her thick wool coat. The icy air burned her lungs, but she needed this outing, this brief breath of freedom. As she pulled up the heavy bucket, she saw something that made her drop the rope. Traces of a struggle in the snow, mixed with dark stains that could only be blood. Her heart raced. She followed the chaotic marks to the edge of the small woods bordering her property. There, leaning against a maple trunk, she found him. The giant man was sitting in the snow, one hand pressed against his left side, from which a trickle of blood stained his torn shirt. His breath formed small white clouds in the icy air, and his eyes, usually so sharp, seemed veiled by pain. A few yards from him lay the bodies of 3 wolves, their gray furs stained with red. "My God," Emily whispered, approaching cautiously. The man looked up at her, and for the first time she heard his voice, deep, gravelly, strained by effort. "They were coming toward your house. I couldn't let that happen." Emily felt something break inside her at this simple, devastating statement. This man had fought for her, had risked his life to protect her home from predators she hadn't even seen coming. Without thinking, she knelt beside him in the cold snow. "We have to tend to that wound," she said in a voice she tried to keep steady but trembled slightly. "Can you walk to the cabin?" The man looked at her with an unreadable expression, as if he couldn't believe she was offering him help. "I don't want to bother you." "Bother me?" Emily couldn't help but let out an incredulous laugh. "You just fought off wolves to protect me, and you're worried about bothering me?" She slipped her arm under his to help him up. The contact with his skin startled her. It was burning hot despite the cold, and she felt the power of his muscles even weakened by the wound. He allowed it, leaning on her more heavily than he would have liked. The journey to the cabin was slow, punctuated by the man's gasps and Emily's whispered encouragements. With each step, she felt Robert's wedding ring jostle against her chest. But strangely, it no longer caused her any pain. Only this man who had shed his blood for her mattered. Once inside the cabin, Emily helped the man sit near the hearth. The warmth of the fire revealed the extent of his injuries. 3 long claw marks that raked his side, deeper than she had thought. She quickly gathered her meager medical supplies: clean cloths, warm water, and some of the mysterious herbs he had given her. "What's your name?" she asked, gently beginning to clean the wounds. "Jonathan," he simply replied, grimacing under her ministrations. "Jonathan Briggs." "Emily Carter." She paused, wondering if she should mention Robert, then decided it wasn't the time. "Those herbs, you brought them to me, didn't you?" Jonathan nodded, his dark eyes following her every move with a troubling intensity. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me to recognize healing plants." Emily applied a compress soaked in thyme infusion, and Jonathan held back a sigh of relief. His large hands, which she had imagined to be so rough, trembled slightly from pain and exhaustion. Why? She suddenly whispered, without looking up from her work. Why are you taking care of me? The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. When Jonathan finally replied, his voice was so low that Emily had to lean in to hear him. I saw you the day you buried your husband. I had come to town for supplies. His fingers clenched on the armrest of the chair. You were so alone, so broken. Something in me couldn't leave. Emily finally looked up at him, struck by the raw sincerity of his words. You've been watching me since then? I just wanted to make sure you were okay. But the more I saw you struggle alone against the winter, the more He stopped, searching for his words. I lost someone too, a long time ago. I know what it's like to want to disappear into the snow. These words touched Emily to her core. She understood now the sadness she had perceived in his eyes during their first visual exchange. They were two wounded souls, united by loneliness and loss. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the scar across his cheek. Jonathan flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. Under her fingers, Emily felt the taut skin, a testament to ancient suffering. Who did that to you? She asked softly. Men who thought they knew the truth, Jonathan replied, his eyes hardening. But that's a story for another day. Emily withdrew her hand, but something had changed between them. An invisible barrier had fallen, and for the first time in months she no longer felt alone in the world. Jonathan spent the night in the cabin, settled by the fire on a blanket Emily had insisted he take. She heard him move sometimes, his whistling breath betraying the pain that still gripped him. In the early morning, when she came down from her bedroom, she found him standing by the window, watching the whitish horizon thoughtfully. You should still rest, she said, approaching him. He turned to her, and Emily was struck by the transformation the night had worked on his face. He seemed less wild, more approachable, as if having been cared for had calmed something within him. I have to tell you something, he declared in a deep voice. Something that's going to sound crazy to you. Emily felt her heart quicken. Tell me. Jonathan looked at her for a long time, as if weighing every word he was about to utter. Before winter ends, you will carry my child. The silence that followed this declaration was so heavy that Emily thought it would crush her. She stared at him, incredulous, searching his eyes for any hint of a joke, but finding none. You're crazy, she stammered, taking a step back. How dare you say something like that? I won't take you by force, Jonathan continued with the same unsettling calmness. Your body already desires me, even if your mind still denies it. I feel it, Emily, just as I feel that you're not truly mourning your husband anymore. These words hit Emily like a slap. She instinctively brought her hand to the wedding ring hanging from her neck, but the gesture suddenly felt artificial, devoid of the usual pain. You don't know me, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I've been watching you for 3 months. I know your habits, your fears, the way you look out the window every night hoping I'll come. Jonathan took a step toward her, his massive presence suddenly filling the entire cabin. I know the loneliness that gnaws at you and the void you're trying to fill. Emily wanted to contradict him, but the words died in her throat. Everything he said was true, and that truth terrified her as much as it attracted her. I'm not ready, she finally whispered. You will be, Jonathan replied with a certainty that made her shiver. When the time comes, you will be. He moved toward the door, and Emily realized with surprise that she didn't want him to leave. Jonathan? He turned to her. Your wounds. Come back tonight, so I can check them. An almost imperceptible smile touched Jonathan's lips. I was counting on it, Emily. And he disappeared into the morning whiteness, leaving Emily alone with her troubled thoughts and a truth she didn't yet dare admit to herself. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, comforting rhythm. Jonathan came every evening, first under the pretense of having his remarkably healing wounds examined, then simply because Emily waited for him. Their conversations slowly deepened, revealing fragments of their past lives like shards of glass they carefully pieced together. Emily learned that Jonathan owned a farm a few miles away, that he had lived alone since the death of his younger sister in a horse accident, and that he knew the Kansas prairies like the back of his hand. In return, she told him about her broken dreams, about her plans with Robert that had never seen the light of day, about that feeling of having become a ghost in her own life. One morning, while looking for wood in the woodshed, Emily came across a box she hadn't opened since they'd settled into the cabin. Inside, carefully folded, were letters from Robert dated weeks before his death, letters he had never intended for her. With trembling hands, she unfolded the first. The words that spread before her took her breath away. Robert spoke of leaving, of starting his life over elsewhere, of the mistake their marriage had been. He mentioned a certain Mary, a widow from the neighboring town he'd been seeing secretly for months. Emily collapsed onto the cold woodshed floor, the letters scattered around her like silent accusations. Everything she had fought for, all that grief she had carried like a sacred burden, was nothing but a lie. Robert hadn't loved her, at least not in the end. He had planned to leave her. That's how Jonathan found her that evening, curled up near the dead hearth, her eyes red, and the crumpled letters clutched in her tight fists. Without a word, he knelt beside her and wrapped her in his powerful arms. Emily leaned against his chest, and for the first time since the discovery, she truly wept. He was going to leave. She sobbed against Jonathan's shoulder. "All this time I've been crying over a man who didn't want me anymore. Then now you're free," Jonathan whispered, stroking her auburn hair. "Free to choose your own future." Emily looked up at him, and in the golden light of the fire he had rekindled, she saw something she had never seen in Robert's eyes. A pure, unconditional, unreserved adoration. Jonathan looked at her as if she were the eighth wonder of the world. Without thinking, she reached for her neck and removed the chain holding Robert's wedding ring. The ring fell to the floor with a metallic clink that echoed like a liberation. For the first time in months, Emily breathed freely. That night was different from all the others. Freed from the dead weight of her false grief, Emily felt reborn, as if an invisible shell had finally broken around her. Jonathan stayed by the fire, watching over her restless sleep, and when she woke in the middle of the night, she found him still there, motionless as a protective mountain. "Don't you ever sleep?" she whispered, coming down from her room. "Not when you need me," he simply replied. These simple words touched Emily deeply. She sat down next to him on the blanket spread before the hearth, their shoulders brushing in the golden gloom. The silence that settled between them wasn't awkward at all. It was the silence of two souls learning to recognize each other. "Tell me about your sister," Emily asked softly. Jonathan's face hardened imperceptibly, but he replied, "Her name was Sarah, 15 years old, hair like ripe wheat, and a laugh that made the birds sing." His voice cracked slightly. "She died because of me." "How so?" "I'd gone to town to sell cattle. She wanted to come with me, but I refused. I said a lady had no business in men's dealings." Jonathan clenched his fists. "She wanted to prove she could ride as well as anyone. The horse bolted near the river. When I came back, she was already gone." Emily placed her hand on his, feeling the guilt that had gnawed at him for years. "You couldn't have known. If I had been there. If I had taken her with me." He shook his head. "Since that day, I swore I'd never again let anyone I loved face danger alone." Emily then understood why he had protected her, why he had risked his life against the wolves. For him, she represented a second chance to atone for his past mistake. But at the same time, she perceived in his eyes something deeper than a simple protective instinct. "And that scar?" she asked, brushing the mark on his cheek again. "Men who thought they knew the truth," Jonathan replied, his eyes hardening. "But that's a story for another day. Is that why you live alone?" "People prefer their lies to the truth when it suits them." He turned an intense gaze on her. "But you, Emily, you look at me without fear. You touch me without disgust. Why?" Emily searched for her words, troubled by the intimacy of the moment. "Because your actions speak louder than gossip. Because you took care of me when I had given up on everything. Because—" She stopped, realizing she was about to say something that would change everything between them. "Because?" Jonathan repeated, his voice so soft that Emily felt her heart race. She took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Because when I look at you, I no longer see death. I see life. I see the future." These words floated between them like a sacred confession. Jonathan slowly reached out to her face, caressing her cheek with infinite tenderness. Emily closed her eyes under this caress, surrendering to a feeling she thought she'd never know again. Desire. Emily, he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Are you sure? For an answer, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was hesitant at first, then grew more and more passionate. Jonathan wrapped her in his powerful arms, and Emily finally felt safe, finally whole after months of gaping emptiness. When they parted, breathless, Emily's cheeks were flushed and her eyes shone with a new light. Jonathan rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the warmth of the fire. There's no going back after tonight, he warned her in a husky voice. I don't want to go back, she replied with a firmness that surprised even herself. What followed was a night of love like Emily had never known. Jonathan was both tender and passionate, attentive to her every reaction, awakening sensations within her she never suspected. In his arms, she forgot the loneliness, the fear, the cold winter that seemed like it would never end. In the early morning, as they lay entwined near the dying embers, Jonathan whispered against her hair, "The child is conceived." Emily didn't protest this time. On the contrary, she placed a protective hand on her belly, as if she could already feel this new life growing within her. The idea no longer frightened her. It filled her with a peaceful joy she hadn't dared to hope for. "How can you be so sure?" she asked without lifting her head from his chest. "I feel it," he simply replied. "Just as I sensed from the first day that you were waiting for me." Emily smiled in the dim light. Perhaps it was superstition. Perhaps Jonathan had gifts she didn't understand. But she chose to believe him. After all, this man had already led her to so many truths about herself. Outside, the wind had stopped howling. For the first time in months, a peaceful silence reigned over the prairie, as if even nature approved of this improbable union between two broken souls who had chosen to rebuild together. Emily closed her eyes, lulled by the steady rhythm of Jonathan's heart. She was finally home. The weeks that followed that magical night were the happiest Emily had ever known. Jonathan no longer went back to his own place. He had become an integral part of her life, her home, her daily routine. He repaired what needed fixing, hunted for their table, and in the evenings they shared moments of intimacy that warmed Emily more than any fire. She already felt subtle changes in her body, a new sensitivity, a gentle fatigue that enveloped her by the end of the day. Jonathan watched over her with a protective gaze, anticipating her needs before she even expressed them. He also taught her the secrets of survival, recognizing animal tracks in the snow, identifying edible plants, handling a rifle with precision. "Why are you teaching me all this?" she asked one morning as he showed her how to skin a rabbit. Jonathan paused, his expert hands poised over the animal. "Because one day you might need this knowledge without me." That answer chilled Emily. "What do you mean?" "My past is going to catch up with us, Emily. Men like me don't live long in peace." He looked up at her, and she read in his eyes a gravity that gripped her heart. "If something happens to me, you'll have to be able to fend for yourself. Nothing will happen to you," she protested. But Jonathan shook his head. "There are things you don't know yet. Enemies I've left behind." He placed his bloody hands on her cheeks. "Promise me that if danger comes, you will leave. Head west as we planned." Emily wanted to protest, but something in Jonathan's gaze stopped her. She nodded, although deep down she knew she could never abandon him. That same afternoon, their fears took shape. A solitary rider appeared on the horizon, riding toward the cabin with a determined air. Jonathan tensed immediately, his hand instinctively sliding to the revolver he now always wore on his hip. "Who is that?" Emily asked, scanning the approaching silhouette. "A bounty hunter," Jonathan replied in a dark voice. "Jack Morrison. I recognize his riding style." The man stopped a good distance from the cabin and dismounted. He was a lean man with a weathered face, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at a glance. "Briggs," he shouted. "I know you're here. I recognized your mark on those dead wolves." Jonathan slowly stepped out of the cabin, his hands visible but ready to draw. "Morrison, what do you want?" "You know perfectly well. There's a bounty on your head from the Henderson brothers affair. $1,000 dead or alive." Morrison spat into the snow. "But I'm not here for that today." "Then why?" The hunter smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. To warn someone I'm more interested in. Sheriff Thomas Carter is coming to town tomorrow. He's asking questions about the protective giant who's been lurking around his daughter-in-law's place. Emily felt her blood run cold. Thomas Carter, Robert's father. After Morrison left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Jonathan paced the room like a caged beast while Emily, sitting by the window, looked at the horizon with apprehension. Thomas Carter's name rang in her head like a death knell. The man who had always despised her, who had always felt his son deserved better than a mere farmer's daughter. "We have to leave tonight," Jonathan declared, stopping in front of her. "We'll take the horses and head west before dawn." Emily shook her head. "I won't run from Thomas Carter. This house, this land, it's all I have left that's rightfully mine. Emily, you don't understand. This man has the power to have me hanged on a mere suspicion. And if he discovers our relationship," Jonathan knelt before her, taking her hands in his, "he'll accuse you of adultery, of dishonoring his son's memory. Then I'll show him the letters," Emily retorted with cold determination. "I'll tell him that his precious son was ready to abandon me for another woman." Jonathan frowned. "What letters?" Emily then told him about her discovery, Robert's cruel words, detailing his plan to flee with Mary. As she spoke, Jonathan's face darkened, not with anger at Robert, but with worry for her. "Those letters won't change anything about his hatred for me," he finally said. "Thomas Carter is looking for someone to blame for his son's death. He won't stand for you finding happiness with another man." But Emily had made up her mind. "I'll never back down from anyone again, Jonathan. That woman who trembled with fear and loneliness no longer exists. You taught me to fight, so I will fight." That night, neither of them slept. Jonathan checked and cleaned his weapons, while Emily gathered Robert's letters into a leather pouch. She reread them one last time, and strangely, they no longer hurt her. These words came from a past that no longer held any power over her. In the early morning, Thomas Carter arrived with 2 deputies. Emily recognized him immediately despite the years. Tall, lean, with a gray mustache and eyes cold as steel. He dismounted with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "Emily Carter," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mock courteous salute. "It seems you're entertaining company." "Sheriff Carter," Emily replied, stepping out of the cabin, Jonathan a protective shadow behind her. "To what do I owe this honor?" "You know perfectly well I've been told a man is living here with you. A man wanted for murder." His eyes settled on Jonathan with disgust. "I suppose that's him, that scarred giant?" "Jonathan Briggs hasn't killed anyone," Emily declared firmly, "and he has every right to be here. I invited him." Thomas Carter sneered. "Invited? My poor child, you're disgracing yourself. Robert has only been dead a few months and you're already wallowing in sin." It was then that Emily pulled out Robert's letters, waving them like a shield. "Your son had already dishonored me long before his death," she said in a clear voice that carried in the icy air. The silence that followed Emily's declaration was so intense you could have heard a snowflake drop. Thomas Carter stared at the letters she wielded, his face shifting from surprise to disbelief, then to a cold, terrible rage. "What are you talking about?" he hissed through his teeth. Emily unfolded the first letter, her hands not trembling in the slightest. "Your beloved son was planning to leave me for Mary Hutchinson, the widow from Millerville. Just listen. My dearest Mary, the arrangements are almost complete. By the end of the month, I will have left Emily and this cursed farm. We can finally be together as we've always dreamed." Emily's voice carried clear and strong in the icy air. Thomas Carter stepped back as if he'd been punched. His deputies exchanged embarrassed glances. That's impossible," the sheriff stammered. "Robert would never—" "There are others," Emily continued relentlessly. "All written in his hand, all dated. Your perfect son found me boring, insignificant. He planned to leave me here to die of cold and loneliness while he built a new life with someone else." Jonathan stepped forward slightly, sensing the tension rising dangerously. He knew this kind of man. When their pride was wounded, they became unpredictable. "Lies!" Thomas Carter suddenly exploded, his hand sliding to his revolver. "You fabricated these letters to justify your depravity. Look at the handwriting," Emily retorted without flinching. "You know your son's handwriting better than anyone." But Thomas Carter no longer wanted to hear. His world, built on the idealized image of his dead son, was crumbling before him. He drew his gun, pointing it at Jonathan. "It doesn't matter what my son did or didn't do. This man is a criminal and I'm arresting him." "No!" Emily instinctively stepped in front of Jonathan, arms spread. "He hasn't done anything wrong." "Stand aside, Emily," Thomas Carter ordered, his voice trembling with rage. "This man has bewitched you, but I'll free you from his spell." Jonathan gently but firmly moved her aside, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Let me handle this," he murmured in her ear. He advanced toward the sheriff, his hands clearly visible and empty. "Thomas Carter, I mean you no harm. Your quarrel is with me, not with Emily." "My quarrel?" Thomas Carter sneered bitterly. "You've dishonored my son's widow. You've sullied his memory." "His memory was already sullied by his own actions," Jonathan replied calmly. "Emily deserves better than to live a lie." The gunshot suddenly echoed, shattering the winter silence. But it wasn't Thomas Carter who had fired. It was one of his deputies. Frightened by a sudden movement from Jonathan, the bullet whizzed past the giant's ear. In the confusion that followed, Jonathan leaped forward, disarming Thomas Carter with a swift move. The two men rolled in the snow, struggling for control of the weapon. The struggle lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed eternal to Emily, who watched, terrified, as the two men wrestled in the reddened snow. Jonathan, stronger and more agile, quickly managed to overpower Thomas Carter and retrieve the gun. He slowly stood up, the revolver pointed at the ground, breathless but victorious. "It's over," he said to the deputies who hesitated between fleeing and intervening. "Leave. Take him and never come back." Thomas Carter, his face bruised and his pride broken, spat blood into the snow. "This isn't over, Briggs. I'll be back with more men. You won't come back." Emily interrupted him, her voice like steel. She stepped toward him, still holding Robert's letters. "Because if you do, these letters will go straight to the Kansas City newspaper. The whole region will know what kind of man your son truly was. Your name and reputation will be destroyed." The sheriff looked at her with pure hatred, but Emily held his gaze without flinching. She was no longer the fragile, frightened young woman he had known. Jonathan had transformed her into a strong woman, capable of fighting for her happiness. "Leave," she repeated, "and forget we ever existed." Painfully, he got to his feet, aided by his men. Before remounting, he cast one last venomous look at Emily. "You'll both regret this." But his words rang hollow, and everyone knew it. He rode back toward town, defeated and humiliated, leaving a peaceful silence in his wake. That night, a mysterious fire destroyed the cabin. Emily and Jonathan barely had time to save their most precious belongings before the flames devoured their refuge. They didn't try to find out who was responsible. It no longer mattered. For in that destruction, Emily gave birth to their son. Amidst the chaos and the cold, guided by Jonathan's expert and tender hands, she brought a perfect little boy into the world, whom they named Samuel. Samuel Briggs Carter, bearing both names as a bridge between past and future. On Christmas morning, as the ashes of their former life cooled behind them, the small group headed west. Emily, holding Samuel against her heart, cast a last look at the smoking ruins. She felt no regret, only immense gratitude for this new beginning. Jonathan rode beside her, strong and protective, his eyes shining with unconditional love. In a saddlebag carefully folded lay Robert's letters, no longer as wounds but as proof of the freedom she had won. The west wind caressed their faces, carrying promises of new lands and a possible future. Emily smiled, feeling Samuel stir against her. She had finally found her place in the world, not as Robert Carter's grieving widow, but as the strong, beloved woman of a man who respected her. Did this story move you? It deeply moved us, too. If Emily and Jonathan's journey resonated with you, subscribe to our channel to discover other stories that celebrate true love and the courage to start over. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what part of this epic journey touched you the most. Your presence brings our stories to life.